On a cold evening in late October, David Miller stepped out of his home for what should have been a routine walk, the kind of quiet habit that had defined his life for years, a short break from the evening, a moment of fresh air before returning to the same familiar routine. But that night something changed, something no one could explain, because David didn't take much with him. No phone call made, no bag, no note. Nothing to suggest he had any reason to stay away. And yet he never came back. And when hours passed, and concern turned into panic, his car was discovered just a few blocks away, sitting in silence under dim streetlights, the keys still resting inside as if he had every intention of returning, the door slightly open as though it had been left in a hurry or never properly closed. And what stood out most was not what was found, but what wasn't, because there was no sign of struggle, no disturbance, no witness who saw him leave or where he went, nothing that could point investigators in any clear direction. It was as if he had simply stepped out of one moment and vanished into the next. And as the days turned into weeks and the search expanded across neighborhoods, forests, and nearby roads, the silence only grew heavier, until years later, something was discovered in a place investigators had already searched, something that raised more questions than answers and forced everyone to reconsider what they thought they knew about that night. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because what happened to David Miller is not just a disappearance. It is a case that continues to challenge logic, memory, and the idea that every mystery can eventually be solved. And the deeper you look into it, the harder it becomes to understand how someone can walk away from everything they know and leave behind nothing but silence. At the center of this case was David Miller, a man whose life followed a steady rhythm, the kind of routine that rarely changes and rarely draws attention. A man who woke up at the same time every morning, went to work, returned home, and lived within a structure that those around him had come to recognize as reliable, predictable, and grounded. And that is exactly what made his disappearance so difficult to understand. Because people like David do not simply walk away without leaving something behind. They do not vanish without explanation, and they do not break away from a life that showed no clear signs of instability. Yet that is exactly what happened, and as investigators began to piece together the details, the case quickly shifted from a simple missing person report into something far more complex. Because there was no single piece of evidence that could explain where he went or why he left. Instead, there was only absence, a silence that refused to provide answers, and that silence led to questions that still remain unresolved. How does someone vanish without leaving a single trace, without being seen, without contacting anyone, without any indication of movement? And even more puzzling, why did new evidence begin to surface years later in areas that had already been searched thoroughly, places where investigators had once concluded there was nothing to find? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, was this truly a disappearance in the way it was first understood, or was it something more deliberate, something shaped by decisions that had been made long before that night? Questions like these do not come with easy answers, and the deeper this case was examined, the more it became clear that understanding what happened to David Miller would require going back to the beginning, to the life he lived before everything changed, to the details that once seemed ordinary but may have held more meaning than anyone realized at the time. David Miller was not the kind of man people worried about, the kind of man whose name would ever be associated with a mystery that stretched on for years without answers, because everything about him suggested stability, a life that followed structure and routine, a man in his mid-50s who had built his days around consistency, waking up at the same time each morning, preparing for work without deviation, greeting familiar faces along the way, and returning home to a life that, from the outside, appeared settled and complete. He held a stable job that he had maintained for years, not driven by sudden ambition or risk, but by reliability, by the quiet understanding that showing up every day mattered more than standing out. And in his neighborhood he was known, not in a remarkable way, but in a way that carried trust, the kind of presence people notice only when it is gone. A man who kept to himself but was always polite, always predictable, always exactly where people expected him to be. And that predictability is what made his disappearance so difficult to process. Because people like David Miller do not simply step away from their lives without leaving something behind. They do not abandon routines that have defined them for decades without reason, and they do not vanish without a trace in a way that leaves no clear direction to follow. At home, his life was shared with his wife, Laura Miller, someone who had been part of that routine for years, someone who understood his patterns and lived within them. And from the outside, their relationship appeared steady, built on familiarity rather than constant change. But like many long-standing relationships, there were layers that were not immediately visible, moments of distance that were easy to overlook, small disagreements that did not escalate, but also did not fully resolve. And over time, those moments began to create a subtle shift in how they interacted, not enough to raise alarm, but enough to suggest that something beneath the surface was changing. Laura remained supportive in the ways that mattered publicly, maintaining the structure of their shared life, but there were signs that things were not as simple as they once were. Slight changes in behavior that were difficult to define, conversations that ended more quickly than before, and an increasing sense that certain things were being kept unspoken. There were nights when she stayed awake longer than usual, moments when her attention seemed elsewhere, and small details like late-night phone activity that, on their own, meant very little, but together formed a pattern that could not be entirely ignored. David noticed some of these changes, even if he did not fully understand them. And like many people in his position, he chose to interpret them in the most reasonable way possible. Stress, routine fatigue, the natural evolution of a long-term relationship. He did not confront every inconsistency. He did not question every moment that felt slightly off, because doing so would have required him to challenge the stability he had spent years maintaining. And so life continued, structured on the same routines, shaped by the same expectations, even as small shifts quietly took place in the background, shifts that would only become significant in hindsight, because at the time none of it seemed connected to anything larger, none of it suggested that something was building toward a moment that would change everything. And that is often how these stories begin, not with a single dramatic event, but with a series of ordinary moments that only reveal their importance once it is too late to go back and see them differently. And at the time, none of it seemed important. The night David Miller disappeared, everything followed the usual pattern, the kind of routine that had defined his life for years, nothing out of place, nothing that suggested anything unusual was about to happen. He spent the evening at home with Laura Miller, moving through familiar habits, quiet conversation, the normal rhythm of a life that had rarely given anyone reason to question it. And when he eventually stepped out for what appeared to be a simple walk, there was no indication that it would be anything more than a brief moment away before returning. No urgency, no tension, no sign that this would be the last time anyone would see him. And yet that routine was broken in a way no one could have anticipated, because David never came back. And as time passed and concern began to build, the situation shifted from expectation to uncertainty, and then to something far more serious. And when his car was eventually found, it only deepened the confusion. It was parked not far from home, positioned in a way that did not immediately raise alarm. But what stood out was what surrounded it. The door was unlocked. The keys were still inside, left behind as if he had every intention of returning, as if whatever happened occurred in a moment that did not allow for planning or reconsideration. And yet there were no signs of struggle, nothing disturbed, nothing broken, nothing that suggested force or confrontation. No witnesses who could place him in that area at the time, no one who saw him get into another vehicle or walk away in a direction that could be followed. It was as if the moment he left that car, he simply ceased to exist within any traceable path. As investigators began to examine the possibilities, the case quickly divided into competing theories, each one attempting to explain what could not be immediately understood. Some believed it could have been a voluntary disappearance, that David had chosen to leave his life behind for reasons that were not yet clear. Others considered the possibility of foul play, that someone had intervened in a way that left no visible evidence. And there were those who questioned whether something internal, something psychological, could have led him to walk away without intention of returning. But each of these explanations carried its own problems, because none of them aligned fully with the evidence, or more precisely, the lack of it. And that absence became the most defining feature of the case, the silence where there should have been answers, the missing connection between what was known and what could be proven. And as the investigation continued, that silence only became more difficult to ignore because nothing about it made sense. Not the timing, not the location, not the lack of any clear direction. It was a situation that resisted explanation at every level. And just when it seemed like there was nothing more to uncover, investigators noticed something. Something small but significant. Something that did not fit with everything that had already been established. Something they couldn't explain. Police began searching immediately, but the case didn't follow a clear path. And from the very beginning it resisted the kind of structure investigators rely on to build answers. Because every step forward seemed to lead to another dead end. And every piece of information raised more uncertainty than clarity. David Miller's phone activity had stopped instantly. Not gradually. Not after a series of calls or messages, but at a precise moment that suggested a sudden interruption, and from that point forward there was nothing, no outgoing communication, no attempts to reach anyone, no sign that he was trying to explain his absence. And when investigators looked into his financial records, they found the same pattern. No bank activity, no withdrawals, no purchases, nothing that would indicate movement or survival beyond that night. And travel records offered no direction either. No tickets, no reservations, no evidence that he had planned to go anywhere at all. It was as if his entire presence had been cut off at a single point in time, leaving behind a gap that could not be filled. When investigators re-examined the timeline, something began to take shape. Not a clear answer, but a pattern that had been overlooked in the early stages of the case. Because at first everything had been treated as isolated moments, separate details that did not seem to connect. But when those details were placed side by side and viewed as part of a larger sequence, inconsistencies started to appear. Small gaps in time where David Miller's movements could not be fully accounted for, moments where the timeline depended more on assumption than confirmed fact. And it became clear that there were periods during that night where no one could say with certainty where he was or what he was doing. And those gaps became the focus of the investigation, because they represented opportunities, moments where something could have happened without being seen or recorded. As investigators dug deeper, they noticed that certain elements of the case did not align with the idea of a spontaneous disappearance. The positioning of the car, the absence of personal belongings, the sudden halt in communication. All of it suggested a level of control that was difficult to ignore. And when combined with the discovery of new evidence in a previously searched location, the possibility that something had been staged began to take on more weight. Because if the scene had been arranged in a specific way, it would explain why so many expected indicators were missing, and why the case had failed to produce clear answers from the beginning. And that realization shifted the entire perspective of the investigation, because it meant that what appeared to be a disappearance might have been something far more deliberate, something constructed to look incomplete while actually hiding a complete sequence of events beneath the surface. And once that idea was considered, the case no longer felt random. It no longer fit the pattern of someone simply walking away or becoming lost without explanation. Instead, it suggested intention, planning, and an understanding of how investigations work, how evidence is gathered, and how it can be avoided. Because this wasn't random, someone understood exactly how to avoid being found. And that possibility changed everything, because it meant that the answers were not just missing, they may have been carefully kept out of reach from the very beginning. But despite years of investigation, despite every theory explored, every lead followed, and every detail examined from multiple angles, no one was ever charged in connection to the disappearance of David Miller, and the case slowly transitioned from an active search for answers into something far more difficult to define, an open file that remained unresolved, with no confirmed suspect, no definitive sequence of events, and no clear conclusion that could explain how a man with such a structured and predictable life could vanish without leaving anything behind. And over time, the absence of answers became the most consistent element of the case, because while evidence had been reviewed and reevaluated, and while certain possibilities had gained more attention than others, nothing had reached the level of certainty required to close the case or bring any form of resolution to those who were left with questions. And David Miller's disappearance remained suspended in that space between what is known and what can be proven, a case that continues to exist without a final explanation. Laura Miller, along with those who knew David was left to navigate a reality shaped by uncertainty, where closure was never fully achieved and where every new development only seemed to reopen questions that had never been answered in the first place. And as time passed, the investigation itself became part of the story, a record of attempts to understand something that refused to be fully understood. And while some believe that the truth may still be discovered, others have come to accept that certain pieces of this case may never come together in a way that provides clarity, because not every mystery reaches a resolution, not every question leads to an answer that can be confirmed, and not every disappearance follows a pattern that can be fully explained. Some cases remain unsolved not because the truth is impossible to find, but because it exists just out of reach, hidden within details that appear ordinary, within moments that were not recognized as significant when they first occurred, and within decisions that only reveal their impact long after they have been made. And the case of David Miller continues to stand as an example of how easily certainty can disappear, how quickly a structured life can be interrupted, and how difficult it can be to reconstruct events when the most important piece is missing. And so the question remains, not just for investigators, but for anyone who hears this story and considers the details for themselves. What really happened to David Miller? And how does someone disappear without leaving anything behind? What do you think really happened that night to David Miller? Was it a decision made in a single moment that no one could have predicted? Or was it something far more calculated? Something that had been set in motion long before anyone realized there was a reason to look closer? Because when you consider the details, the routine he lived by, the way everything stopped so suddenly, and the evidence that appeared years later where it shouldn't have been, it becomes harder to accept a simple explanation. And that is what makes this case stay with people, not just because it remains unsolved, but because it challenges the way we understand certainty, the idea that a life can be stable one day and completely untraceable the next. And if this case left you questioning everything, if it made you look at the details more closely and reconsider what might have been missed, then the next story may leave you with even more to think about, because there are cases where the truth is even more difficult to define, where the answers raise more questions than the mystery itself. So if you want to follow more real stories like this, stories that stay with you long after they end and don't always offer clear conclusions, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. And as you think about everything you've just heard, ask yourself one final time, if you were in that situation, if you were looking at the same evidence, would you have seen something others didn't? Or would David Miller's disappearance remain just as unresolved?